Thank you all for coming. I'm Catherine O'Donnell, Associate Director of the IHR, and not for the first time this spring, I have the privilege of participating in an event that is purely the brainchild of Ron Broglio, who had the wonderful thought that the IHR should be a place in which people just come together to talk about what we do in an informal way. And so that's what we're here to do today. And this made me realize, thinking about this made me realize that when I started graduate school, I had the idea that I would prove that I understood what humanities were about. If somebody handed me a book, I would look at it and I would say, this is what is wrong with this book. These are the flaws. And now I feel like I can demonstrate that I know what the humanities are about by if someone hands me a book, I say, oh my gosh, you wrote a book. You wrote a book. That is remarkable. And that's kind of the spirit of our morning. It's a bit of a slog and a bit of a miracle, both. And we are very happy to have you talk about it in both of those ways or in any way that you wish. And then we will have this conversation for our colleagues. So I'm going to introduce you all at the beginning very briefly, so then you will simply converse and talk without interference for the rest of the time. Lígia Bezerra is Assistant Professor of Portuguese at the School of International Letters and Cultures, and her book, Everyday Consumption in 21st Century Brazilian Fiction, published in 2022 by Purdue, is the first in-depth study to map the representation of consumption in contemporary Brazilian prose. It highlights, in really engaging fashion, how our interactions with commodities connect seemingly disconnected areas of everyday life, including eating habits, the growth of prosperity theology, and ideas of success and failure. And because we are who we are in academia, we've also asked them all what they're doing next. So I'll include a little bit of that. Bezerra's next project investigates how Brazilian popular music has responded to the threat to democracy posed by the rise of the far right in Brazil in recent years. Our own Ron Broglio is Professor of English and Director of the Institute for Humanities Research. His book, Animal Revolution, was published by the University of Minnesota Press this past spring, and he is currently working on transformational knowledge, on how what we know and think is changed by ecstatic experience. So I'm laughing that we made them talk about what they want to do next, but now I'm like, you need to finish these books because I want to read them also. Elizabeth Rosa Horan is Professor of English, affiliate of Transborder Studies and the Spanish program in Silk. And her most recent book, House of Memory, Jewish Women Writers of Latin America, was edited with Marjorie Agason and Alison Ridley and published by Solis Press in Great Britain very recently, November 2022. And she is now completing people in Spanish, the final chapter of the first scholarly document-based biography of Gabriela Mistral, the poet, diplomat, journalist, celebrity. So Gabriela Mistral y la Secretaria will be published with Penguin Random House later this very year. And Jenny Irish is an assistant professor of creative writing and extraordinarily prolific and broad in her work. And she does everything else too, so I'm not clear how all this happens. Most recently, she is the author of Lupine from Black Lawrence Press this spring, right? Just out. And she also has a forthcoming collection, Hatch, in which she traces the consciousness of an artificial womb who must confront the role she has played in continuing the dying human species. So there we have them, and please go on.
Thank you. This is on, I guess. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for putting this together. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to talk a little bit about my work. I know we have very little time, so I'm going to just dive right in. And one of the things that the IHR had asked us to talk about was, the contribution of the work. And to some extent, you already read part of that, but I just want to expand a little bit more. So I think that the book contributes in 3 or 4 main ways. It's the first in-depth study of the representation of consumption in Brazilian, contemporary Brazilian literature in the 21st century. And it's also, it demonstrates a variety of ways in which consumption ways of viewing consumption in everyday life beyond this good or bad, engaged or alienated dichotomy that has dominated this field of Brazilian studies, Brazilian literature. So typically studies of representations of consumption in Brazilian literature since the 1970s, when this became a really major topic in the literature, tend to either focus on narratives that are extremely like apocalyptic about consumption and consumer culture, or they tend to sometimes gloss over the nuances of certain representations of consumption when, perhaps not everything is so apocalyptic about it. It's not quite, talked about. So what I propose in the book is that by looking at 10 different narratives by 7 writers, and I tried to have as much of a variety in terms of gender and also social class as possible. So I would like to have had even more, but time constraints have to, have to finish the project at some point. I propose that there is actually more of a spectrum rather than a dichotomy in terms of how these narratives represent consumption, the ways that we interact with consumer culture and with consumer goods in daily life, and also in terms of how they envision ways of existing in consumer society. And I came up then with these categories, which are by no means, exhaustive, but that kind of summarize what I saw happening and what I see happening in 21st century Brazilian literature. And they go from totalizing dystopia to what I call utopic reinvention, radical temporary suspension, oscillatory awareness, and transformative hope. And for me, it was very important to look, especially with look at how consumer culture is represented, the way that we interact with consumer goods was represented by writers that belong to the working class. Because what I found was writers of middle class origin, they tend to, when they talk about lower working class consumption, it's normally what tends to be blamed for, disastrous futures, because people don't know, the working class or the lower classes don't know how to consume. If they're given government assistance, they will spend it on things that are not, essential. They will buy things that they shouldn't. So there's this sort of policing of working class consumption. There's a lot of prejudice around it. And I wanted to see also how that gets portrayed by working class writers. And that's where the transformative hope comes in, because what we see is also, ways of interacting with consumption with consumer goods that are for sure negative as well, and that cause a responsible, consumer culture is in part responsible for the social disparities that we see. In these writers acknowledge that, but also there are ways of interacting with goods, with products that also build community, that also convey a sense of pride for having achieved something, and that recognize that we live in a society that constantly asks us to consume, and that places our value on what we consume and how we consume, but that at the same time denies many of us that right to consume, right? So these authors, they problematize that as well. And I think the book also shows how consumption connects seemingly disconnected areas of our everyday life. So in looking at these different ways of looking at consumption, I found different themes that these writers approach, such as religion, trauma, eating habits, interpersonal relationships, beliefs about success and failure are some of the examples. And because they touch upon these topics, then I think the book has a contribution that goes beyond just understanding the Brazilian context, but also reflecting about these issues that really, affect anybody who lives in a neoliberal society today, right? Which is many, many, many of us, to say the least. So the other thing that we were asked to talk about was the process, like how the book came up. And I could not mention the personal, because I think the personal has a lot to do with this book. I feel like the seeds for this book were planted in my childhood. I come from a working class family, and my mom is a teacher today. She's a school principal, and she suffered from childhood hunger. And like many in Brazil, was denied the right to consume many, many things, including food. And so, but who also, thanks to charity, was able to go to school and to get an undergraduate degree when I was little. And finished her PhD at the age of 60, just a few years ago. And then on the other hand, I had my dad who only finished 4th grade because, again, large family, poor family, couldn't afford to send everybody to school. So he wasn't one of the chosen ones. And so I was surrounded by books and culture and all these things, but also I come from the so-called millennials. I'm one of the oldest of the millennials. So I grew up with a generation bombarded by commercials and all sorts of products and watching TV all the time. So I've always thought about these things in one way or another, how consumption in everyday life affects us in different ways. And then, fast forward to grad school, I developed this interest in interdisciplinary research with my first MA in linguistics, studying French discourse analysis, which is very interdisciplinary. And then moving on to my second MA in the United States, and then my PhD, in which I did a minor in cultural studies. And that's where these different things connected everyday life, consumption, contemporary culture. I started to connect the dots during my PhD. And then beyond the PhD then came, this interest continued. And so I worked with Argentine narratives as well during my PhD, but my book focuses only on Brazil. And I worked on a, somewhat different project for the PhD. This book is, all the narratives are new. So I identified narratives, finding common themes, and then following the evidence, so to speak, like one of my professors in the PhD minor used to say, the methodology for culture studies is, follow the evidence. So see where it takes you. And where it took me was to a number of different areas, interesting things that I got to learn about: sociology, anthropology, literary criticism, philosophy, media studies, psychology, and so on and so forth. So I know we don't have much time, so I'm just going to finish here. The book is available through open access through Purdue libraries, and I'm very, very happy about that. Especially being what it is, being what it is about. I'm very happy that it's available for free, and you can download through that. And I want to acknowledge Purdue University Libraries for the open access funding that they provided, and also the Institute for Humanities Research and the School of International Letters and Cultures, which provided a subvention grant. So thank you. Obrigada.
Hello. Oh, okay. Yeah. I need this. I do? Okay. So yeah, I'm Elizabeth Horan. Thank you for coming. Great to see everyone here. I'm talking about a book also dealing with Latin America. And it's the second edition of a book. I thought I'd bring both editions so that you could see that. The first one dates from 1999, and it was the first one of its kind. It's a collection of short stories by Jewish women writers of Latin America. There was no previous book of that sort. And I am the translation editor, and I did it with my friend Marjorie Agosine. And I really think of translation as an act of friendship. It's a form of collaboration, even if the person is dead, or even especially if they're dead, because then you're using a Ouija board when you're looking in your dictionary and that sort of thing. But it's one of several books that I did with my friend Marjorie, and who I thought I'd tell a little bit about how we met. And that's that I was in Chile as a Fulbright under Pinochet, and it was toward the end of the Pinochet regime. And I left and then moved across the country to start working in Boston. And I looked Marjorie up because we had friends in common. And she was just starting her career at that point. She was an assistant professor at Wellesley College and beginning to get interested in, she was working on the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo. And she was working on the theme of the desaparecidos, arpilleras, which are an art form that women in Chile were particularly using to both gather together and to in a form that they could not be challenged by the state. So at any rate, I was living in these were very difficult times, 1989, 1990 for Chile. 1987, 1988 or so for Chile, because everyone knew that the dictatorship was going to fall, but no one knew how or how bloody it might be. it was pretty sure that it wasn't going to be as bad as it had been in 73, but that it was going to fall. And so I would meet with Marjorie, and we would talk about our obsession with Chile. We had many friends in common, and I kept on telling her, you need to do some more work on Jewish women writers, on Jewish writers. It's a really great topic. And she said, oh, okay. And one of the great things about working at Wellesley is that basically they had enormous subvention grants for basically, you have a book, they'll publish it. They'll pay you a subvention for it. And Marjorie was raring to go. So she has since become incredibly prolific. Stayed at Wellesley. I wonder why. And in doing this book with her, she had approached me after we did, I wrote the introduction to a memoir that she did about her father, whom I knew. The Jewish community in Chile is quite small. And Chile at that time, when I lived there were no foreigners, none whatsoever, because who in their right mind would go to Chile under a fascist dictatorship? But I went there as a scholar, beginning my work investigating Gabriela Mistral, and everyone in the world wanted to talk to me. Everyone, because I wasn't Chilean and because I spoke Spanish. And they all wanted me to know that no one supported the dictatorship, and it was a moment of solidarity. And when I left, befriending Marjorie and working with Chileans and Argentines was a way to continue that solidarity. One of the things that I noticed that I found very strange in Chile was living in a country that was officially Catholic. It's in the Constitution. The Constitution is still vigente. It's still alive because of the recent debacle in trying to get the new Constitution approved. And so Judaism has a marginalized, extremely marginalized status in Chile. And I frequently observed anti-Semitism, and it surprised me the extent to which it was operating. And so she and I spoke about that, and spoke about the need to have the women writers in particular better known outside of Latin America as a way for people to understand the complexities of the Southern Cone in particular. And to be able to compare and contrast these different nations and their literatures. So I'll tell you some funny stories here. So when we put together this one, you may notice that there was no longer a slightly resemblance, but I had to fight with the press about getting credit on the cover as a translator. If anyone here has ever done translation, you know that presses are very happy to see you come and clean up the manuscripts and make sure that everything's okay. But the press is not all that chill about having translators recognized, because they feel that it will hurt sales, at least in the United States, less so in other countries. And so this was published by the City University Feminist Press at CUNY in New York. And it doesn't have, this is an advanced publication, it doesn't have my name on the back cover, but this one, the actual one that was not the advanced copy did, and this one also does. And it's also in the Library upon Risk publication data, which is what most matters. So any of you thinking of doing translation, which is again a wonderful work of collaboration and friendship, it's a ton of fun. It's very different from the solitude of writing a monograph, to be sure. Then you just need to turn into a real jerk when it comes to working with the press and insist on it. So when Marjorie decided that it was time to redo this, this book is now close to 25 years later. We included new generation writers, younger writers, and omitted a couple from here that Marjorie didn't feel worked all that well, and wanted to included more writers from the younger generations in Chile and Argentina in particular. I didn't feel that we got enough from Brazil, but we include Clarice Lispector, Margot Clance. We changed the title a little bit she's a writer from Mexico. and provided a little bit more background about the incredibly diverse Jewish communities of Latin America, because people have come to each nation in different waves, in different times, and under a range of circumstances. And so, and that's something that's really strongly reflected in the writing of women, because they are in charge of the home, and the way that domesticity is expressed is extremely different from one nation to the next. So I don't want to say any more here, but I'm happy to talk with people afterwards. I'm going to pass it to you.
Thanks. Great. And this is Animal Revolution. Just to give you a small taste of it, I thought I'd read just a little bit. Animals of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. I've tried handing animals weapons, kitchen knives, a slightly rusted backyard chain, a shotgun, tools for the revolution. Lord knows they need a revolution and have suffered enough abuse at our hands. They generally stare at me blankly. They look at the anthropocentric machine I extend to them and stare at them again, blankly. With bare look and still corporeal thickness, these animals make no motion towards arming themselves. Now I feel like the idiot. What do I know about their revolution? Perhaps they already come armed. Perhaps the revolution is underway, modalities I have yet to know, and beyond what I can reason within the limits of my human sensibilities and sociabilities. So that gives you just a little flavor of the revolution. I tried to write. I've been collecting stories. We all have these stories of animals jamming the gears of the social machine and sticking it to humans. And they're fun stories. They're usually one-offs. And I started a small blog, shows you how far back that was, in 2005, just to record them and some of my own reflections. And that became sort of a public/private way of collecting research that was searchable. And I included images with that because I think sometimes remember things through images. So, you know, if I needed something on octopus, I could type in octopus, etc. I tried to write, I had written a few essays that were more academic about some of this work, questions of Derrida and hospitality. How do we be hospitable to someone beyond ourselves? It's easy to be hospitable with friends, but that's really not hospitality, it's friendship. What does it mean to be radically hospitable? And so I'd written some about that. I'd written a piece then for The Atlantic on radioactive boar in Eastern Germany, and they're radioactive due to eating tubers that absorbed radiation from Chernobyl. So that was my first turn towards a slightly more public writing. But yet I wasn't satisfied with the way it was being written. I felt like it wasn't getting the wonder and the play that I was thinking about in this term animal revolution, and what's possible there. And so another great academic tradition is having beers with friends. And so Matt Bell and I had a lot of drinks together, and we became really good friends. And he was writing his novel Appleseed, and I was talking to him about ideas related to that on animism and so forth. And he was helping me with this. And he said, well, have you looked into creative nonfiction? And recommended a few pieces. And so then I had some models and I was off and running. And, you know, it gave me really the very simplest coaching that was really helpful about, you know, the whole typical thing the academics want to tell rather than show. You know, it's, if it's 2 + 2, we say 2 + 2 = 4, whereas in creative writing, you might just say 2 + 2, and the go figure, the people figure out it's 4, you know, that kind of thing. I'm telling Jenny's like, yes, I know all these things. But for me, it was a real turn and the ability to think and write about this material. So what happened from that was the opportunity to really think through some fun stories. And then the readers' reports were wonderful because they allowed me to think of this book in two halves. One is more of the animals in revolt, and the other is humans turning in relationship to the animals. So there's a section called State of the Union. The first president of the United States was a cyborg. George Washington's various dentures were a cabinet of curiosity holding 18th century natural history lessons, economic exchange, and political relations. Contrary to popular belief, none of his teeth were made of wood. Instead, his dentures were a collection of bones and metal. He bought teeth from his slaves, who certainly felt the asymmetry of power in the exchange. Other teeth were likely from corpses. Some were from cows and horses, fashioned to fit a human mouth. Teeth were made from elephant tusks. Perhaps some were from whalebone. Unsubstantiated rumor is that the bone from the first unearthed mastodon was sculpted into a tooth and was given as a gift to the president. Also in his mouth were parts of the earth itself, mined and refined metals, including tin, copper, and brass alloy. Rolling his tongue against his teeth, Washington could feel prehistoric time. He could clench the tusk of an animal from a distant continent against bone from a creature of the deep sea. While sipping a brandy, he might imagine cold, damp mines, catch a hint of the fire and smoke from the smelting and the acrid taste of minerals. He might muse on the relationship between cow's teeth and the beef he was eating, or his horse teeth and the bit and bridle he held like a connective string to the teeth of his war horse Nelson. Did he ever look at one of his servants, look into his mouth and the vacuous space among the teeth, and while holding the slave's tooth in his own mouth, think of the relationship between the two of them beyond commodity exchange? In the dark of evening, after company has left and the quiet of his home, Washington unburdens himself of the crafted yet uncomfortably fitted and heavy form of bone and metal. His jaw unclenches and he feels the absence of shape in his mouth. Before cleaning it and putting the apparatus away, he looks at it glimmering with slava in the candlelight. Now neither in his mouth nor in the human and animals and earth from whence the dentures came, he thinks of those absences, the incompleteness that he and the others have. He holds their missing jigsaw puzzle pieces in his hands in the dark vacuity of the night, the dark emptiness of his mouth, and out there, the empty of the space that once held substance, he feels the connecting morality. He's aware of his own time on earth is bought at the expense of others, but still the arc will lead toward the grave. How much of these other lives resonate in the talisman that the president carries in his carnivorous mouth? The animals revolution has hacked into the head of state by exploiting the decay of his teeth. The words he speaks comes from a mouth filled with slaves, corpses, and animals. His words vibrate from elements of deep time and earth, and his food is masticated by them as well. This towering leader might make use of humans and animals and minerals, but what a figure for the powerful future of a revolution that plants itself intimately within the president. Washington has felt and daily knows that his voice is not his own. If the president is the mouthpiece for the nation, the country speaks as a heterogeneous, more than human, mineral, animal, human state of the union. It is a place of many beings with many lives, each in their own worlds, grinding against each other and negotiating a shared earth. So that's Washington. And while I was finishing this, Matt said, okay. I said, okay, I think I'm done. He looked at it, he said, you know, you could publish it. but you only get to publish Animal Revolution once. It's like, keep going. And that opportunity to dig deeper. So what I just read to you was initially only 2 paragraphs. And that opportunity to dig a bit deeper and really find something in those pieces. And then he said, and what about you, the field marshal of the Animal Revolution? What's at stake for you? I'm like, I'm an academic. I don't write about myself. And there is then a chapter in here about my own animalities, and which is inspired in the next book. So the opportunity to shift styles of writing and styles of thought and what that affords, I think, is incredibly valuable for us as academics, but more importantly as thinkers and as figures out in the world. One of the privileges of tenure, in fact, is to be able to write about things that one normally maybe not could write about, and to write in ways that one normally wouldn't. This would not be a book for me for tenure, but it's certainly the privilege of academic freedom to unleash other modes of thought.
Thank you so much, Ron, for reading for us. That was really, you read beautifully. Incredibly powerful what you read. Thank you. So, hi. It's so nice to be here with you, Lígia and Elizabeth and Ron, and I appreciate the invitation. My name is Jenny Irish. I am an assistant professor in the creative writing program. The book that I was invited here to talk about is called Lupine. It's a series of prose poems that are written in the voices of figures that are monstrous or that are presumed monstrous. There's a kind of story that I've always really been interested in part because of its simplicity and what I think that simplicity allows. And it's a kind of story that I describe as a stranger comes to town. And so in novels and novellas, there is this commonly seen trope where a stranger comes to town and their arrival follows one of 2 paths. Either in either way, it's disruptive. They either disrupt things by their presence, by being a stranger, by exposing the people and the space to things with which they're unfamiliar, or they enter into this space and they become an agitator. And maybe there is a figure who's been a part of this community or an entity or an element that's long been part of this community that has been tolerated, but the stranger comes to town and acts as this agitating force. And in this trope of, again, I think we see it most frequently in novellas and novels where a stranger comes to town and disrupts the norm. There are really only 2 ways that this particular story ends, but a lot of complexity in the middle. And those 2 ways are either the stranger has to be assimilated or the stranger has to be purged. And I've always been very interested in this basic form and how each example of this that I've encountered ends in the same way, with assimilation or purgation, as if those are the only 2 options that we could think of. And I think that's concerning. So part of what inspired Lupine was an interest in that trope, a stranger comes to town. And a larger part of what inspired Lupine was the fact that I think that we live in a time when we're all terribly frightened. And I think that that fear is very, very justified for a huge, vast, complex variety of reasons that is shared across many of us and that differs between many of us. But I do think that we live in a time when we're all afraid. We're watching climate change occur at an incredible rate. We have some awareness that certain things have gone far enough
that we may have missed their moment of correction. I feel like in the 10 years that I've been a teacher, I have seen the classroom space really change from a space of shared respect and enthusiasm and an openness to a space of often hostility and contention. That is the place that we're starting from, suspicion, hostility, and that is what from day one we're working against and we're encountering, and we have to try to navigate and contend and gain a trust. And I would also say a respect, a mutual respect that in my previous experience was already there, was an assumed part of the teacher-student relationship. So there is, in my experience, a lot of incredibly rapid shifts. So this book, Lupine, as I said, is a series of prose poems that are in the voices of a number of different figures that are monstrous or would perhaps be labeled as monstrous, and is, I think, asking us, or I would hope is asking us, to consider what we do with the fear that we all have. Because I believe we all have that fear. And when I encounter someone who seems to have toward myself an automatic hostility, I want to try to understand that, and I want to try to change that. I want to create this space for us to instead exist in a place of mutual respect. And that can take a lot of time, and that asks a lot of trust. So in Lupine, a series of monstrous figures speak, and they're telling their own experiences. And again, I hope what the work is doing is really asking us to think about what we do with this fear that we all have. And I think the first thing that we have to do is acknowledge it. And that in itself is scary, and that in itself is asking an awful lot, to admit that we are terribly afraid, and to admit, I believe, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but I believe that we're living in a time of great uncertainty. So the first step is an acknowledgement of that, and then looking at how that fear and how that instability directs our actions. And then really questioning those actions, interrogating those actions. And if we're strong enough, if we're brave enough, if we're kind enough, if we can allow ourselves to be soft enough to move into a place of trust and openness again, rather than a place of rigidity and fear and a rejection. As I think, again, only speaking for myself, I think that's the easy way. And I think the responsibility that we have to one another is much, much greater than taking the easy way. And I think that's wherein hope lies, both for our profession and for our planet and for, like, all species. We need to care about one another. We can't let our fear place us into a situation of hostility where our first thought is, how can I make sure that you don't get the thing that I want? How can I make sure that I can stockpile the most? Instead, how do we get to a place where we think about, what do I need and how can I share what I don't to most effectively help others, to most effectively ensure that someone else can do the same? So that is the basic, I think, hope or goal of the work, that it would ask us to consider some of these things through the voices of these monstrous figures. So in speaking through these figures also, what I will say is that for me, part of writing is joy. Sometimes this is very frowned upon. I feel like in creative writing, we're supposed to be very serious and tortured all of the time. And I feel like life delivers unto us enough seriousness and daily torture and goodness, complex things to keep us up at night, that if there's a space where we can find joy, it's okay to sit in that space of joy, even if you're writing about serious and challenging things, even if you want the work to be treated or received with a kind of seriousness. It's also okay to have a joy in it. So a lot of the collection is quite serious, and I think is looking at things like mass extinction, like climate change, like the commodification of bodies and the way we use both human and animal bodies really recklessly and thoughtlessly for our needs. But then there's also another element where if someone picks this up because it's a book about monsters and they enjoy the monsters' voices and they enjoy the way a unicorn talks versus the way a sea serpent talks versus the way a woman accused of witchcraft talks, that's fantastic. And that serves an equally, to me, again, only speaking for myself, an equally valuable purpose. And I'm happy if that happens. It's great when both of those things happen, when people both experience maybe the goal of the book and joy within that experience. But I'm happy too if people just find joy. And that is, I would say, one of the reasons that I write as well, because it is something that does bring me joy, but because I also think there is, or I hope there is, the space and things that I write for others to find joy. I think we talked about translation being collaborative, and I'm so fascinated with translation. I always read translations with my classes, and I know nothing about the field, but I have a number of students who are in the translation certificate program, and I'll always have them share their knowledge because it's just wonderfully fascinating. I always love reading the translator's notes. I have no idea where I was going with this, none whatsoever. Totally lost now. So I suppose I will stop there. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thanks all of you so much. And I'm struck by how writing a book is such a personal, sometimes isolating experience, but how you all emphasize the relationships that the book emerged from and your kind of urgency in getting us to understand other creatures' consciousness and sort of sharing that. So thinking of other creatures, we have a little bit of time left, and the IHR is part of a community in which people are always trying to write a book, right? Most of us, many of us are always working on a book. And since you have just finished this, or some of you have written many books, I wonder just what you would share, anything about what you find particularly valuable about writing a book. Just as an example, I know I can never get over it when someone has read a book that I've written, or I'm like, seriously, it's like it was in my head and like you have it on your shelf. Like just something, I can never get over that. There's just, to me, something particularly wondrous about books. But I'm old. And an historian, and maybe that's not how you feel, but anything that you'd like to share about the process of writing a book, or what's special to you about books, or how you sat there in the dark and you almost gave up on your book, but you didn't, anything at all. We'll just go make one more round.
Oh, trying to figure out where to start, but I think that, so as I shared with you, my mom is in education, and we talk a lot about, education and teaching and things like that. And Paulo Freire, who is a, big, fantastic figure in Brazilian education and has influence, outside of Brazil as well. And there's always this question of like, what is our role? What can we do to make the world better? And at times it sounds so utopian. And do we really make a difference? And she always says to me that, and if by studying and teaching, if you can change yourself and you can change maybe one more person, you already made a huge difference, because then you are going to act differently and that person is going to act differently, and they're going to, and this is going to multiply. So not in the sense that we're going to change the world overnight, but that our work does matter in what we do. And I think that writing a book for me is a little bit of that too. It's, I learned so much, tremendously much, about so many different things. And I have brought this into the classroom with me, and the enthusiasm with which I find students discussing these things, and talking about these things. And one of my students said, at the end of the semester, he said, so the goal, no, it was mid semester. He said, so the goal of this class is to get us really mad every time, right? So we go out there and we do something. And I said, kind of, so what are you going to do with that mad, right? So what can we do as not just as individuals, as consumers, but as citizens, and what kind of change can we bring collectively, thinking about others and trying to understand how other people live, also people that have different experiences. And I think that for me, the process of writing this book brought that, and I look forward to, repeating that experience in the future, writing other books as well.
Thank you for that great question, and thank you too for sharing that about your own writing. One of the things I tell my students when they're looking for a topic is I say, don't write about stuff that you like. Write about something that bothers you. And I write about stuff that really bothers me. Almost everything that I do, whether it's translation, the monograph I'm working on now, it's a puzzle, and I need to put the pieces together somehow, and they're often missing. So I find the missing pieces, which is the great pleasure of biography. Find all these, and I get all this stuff that I learned that I can't use, unfortunately. In doing archival work, you fall in love with these people that are long dead, long forgotten. And sometimes I get prejudiced. One will have great handwriting. Thank you. Nice paper, great handwriting. Oh, I can forgive you all of the terrible things that you did. You have nice paper, great handwriting. And then I have to. But it's a puzzle, and translation is a puzzle as well. It's how can I get English to be more like Spanish? How far can I push English? How far can I push it a little further? So I can play with the word order. Okay, I can play with, okay, can I leave in some Spanish words? I don't know. We'll see. And it's going back and forth and then trying it out. And it's this continual thing of fitting together these puzzles. Sometimes they're smaller puzzles, like the puzzles from the archives. Sometimes they're larger puzzles, the puzzle of a life. How do you write it? How do you write a single book about a person's life, especially the person that I've been cursed with writing about? And so in my current work, I did not intend to write this book in Spanish, but that's where the market is, and the translator kind of bailed. And so that's what I'm doing. And it's insane during a pandemic, particularly, writing it in Spanish. But I have an awesome copy editor. That's all I can say. And Random House has put up with a lot from me. And so, yeah, I'll move this along and hear what other people have to say.
Yeah, thanks for a really generous and generative question. And for me, writing is being alone together, in the sense that it's you and trying to figure out and wrestle some words and ideas and figuring out your own mind, but together in the sense that like language isn't mine. It came before me and will come after me, and so I have to negotiate that. And I'm thinking about the people I'm writing it for, who are my audiences, and they're not vague or abstract. They're actual people. And also in this case, and often my animal work, the dignity of these animals that I'm writing for, and wanting to, it's wanting to do right by them, sort of doing right by the outsiders and the monsters and figuring out those relationships. So it's wrestling with my own finitude. I can't say it all. Every choice, every word is the death of other choices and other possibilities. And so it's coming up against my own mortality. And yet at the same time, realizing that that's the place that allows things to thrive. And really, then when it comes out, and as you were saying, when people read it, you're like, wow, I'm alone, but I'm together with all these other people, and it's going sort of, it has a life beyond ourselves, which is really weird, right? Yeah. So.
Thank you, Ron. So as you were all speaking, I remembered the point that I was trying to get to before when I just trailed off. What I was going to say was, I always think of writing as this collaborative act. It's something that we tend to do alone, but the outcome, the book, it's not for us, it's for others. So whenever I publish something, it's not really mine anymore. I have no control of how it's taken and how it's received and what's done with it. And I'm okay with that. I think that's a good thing, that it just goes out into the world and people will encounter it and they'll do with it what they will. So I always think of writing as collaborative, and that matters. And I hope that people will find my work and it will mean something to them. But I'm also okay just saying, once this is put out into the world, it doesn't belong to me anymore. The other thing that I think about a lot is, as a teacher, and I think I would always call myself a teacher and someone who feels very, very fortunate to be a teacher before I would say that I'm a writer, is that as a teacher who is also a writer, something that's important to me is making clear-ish as often as is possible that there's more than one pathway to success, and that people's success looks very, very different, and that's okay. So I have an amazing colleague, Matt Bell, and my career will never look like Matt Bell's, and that's absolutely fine. That I do something very different, and there's space for both of those things in the world. This book is actually dedicated to a colleague of mine, a very dear colleague who has also been a teacher, who also, I think, has always been incredibly encouraging that I should just chase whatever curiosity that I have, Alberto Rios. And he's another person where my career will never look like the career of Alberto Rios, but that's okay. There's space for what he does. There's space for what I do. There's space for what Matt does. There's space for all of this, and there's readers for all of it, and there's readers who potentially have a hunger and a need for all of it. And I think regardless of what you're doing, and regardless of the pathway that you're doing it, and regardless of the scope at which it's entering into the world, it's out there in the world to be received. So that's another thing I think about, that we have to be really open to, as teachers, what success is and what that looks like, and to kind of embrace all versions and possibilities of that and be really celebratory of them.
Thank you all so much. That was a wonderful hour and a wonderful conversation, and we're so grateful for you and for your books. So thank you.
Yeah.